Hi everyone, it's Angela from Broadhead Memorial Public Library back with another episode of Have You Heard? We are continuing to read Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH by Robert C. O'Brien with pictures by Zena Bernstein. We do want to thank Athenaeum Books for Young Readers for allowing us to share this story with you. If you are enjoying Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH or any of our other stories, be sure to like our videos, and you can also subscribe to our page at the link below. All right, so when we left off yesterday, we learned how the rats escaped the laboratory and also how they spent their first winter in a big mansion with lots of food and lots of books. Let's find out what happens next. This chapter is called The Main Hall. There came a knock on Nicodemus's office. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Ages entered. "Back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon," said Justin. "It's past noon. It's lunchtime." "Past noon?" Mrs. Frisby stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rat's home, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time, and she had been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she had not glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here's Dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. He asked Mrs. Frisby, "Did he tell you about the toy tinker?" Nicodemus said, "No, I was just coming to that." But I can't stay to hear it now," said Mrs. Frisby. "My children will be waiting for their lunch." A plan was worked out. Mrs. Frisby would go home to take care of her children. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving her house, which would be done that night at about 11 o'clock, after the Fitzgibbons are asleep, and we're sure Dragon is too, said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby would return in the mid-afternoon to the rose bush. Mr. Ages said, I'm going to lie down. After making that trip with this cast, I'm tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenner and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty." "Thank you," said Mr. Ages. "Mrs. Frisby, when you return, I will tell you as well as I can exactly how to put the powder in Dragon's food." As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisby considered just how much she could tell her children about all that had happened and all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage, at least, she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats. Also, that she would not say she had volunteered to put the sleeping powder into Dragon's bowl. That would worry them. She could tell them perhaps when it was safely done, when, among other things, there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer in her place. She would tell them simply that as the owl had suggested, she had gone to the rats and asked for help. She had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it would be safe from the plow. That would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later, when she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were skeptical at first, then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still staying in bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin had made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Nobody does. They keep to themselves." "Maybe it's because the owl sent me," said Mrs. Frisby, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "They seem to be impressed by the owl." "For that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl wanted to help. He's no friend of ours, either." "Maybe they thought someday we could do them a favor in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favor?" "You forget. I did do Jeremy a favor. That's what started the whole thing." "That and my getting sick," said Timothy. "I wish I could get up. I'm tired of bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisby, glad to change the subject. "You must save your strength, because tonight you will have to get up for a little while when they move the house. We must be sure you're well wrapped up and hope that the night is warm." "It will be," said Martin. "It's turned quite hot outside." They ate their lunch. That afternoon, Mrs. Frisby told the children that she must leave them to confer again with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the danger she would face in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss them all goodbye. But knowing that Timothy, at least, was already suspicious, she did not dare, but told them only that they should not worry if she was a little late getting home for supper. On her way back to the Rosebrook, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problem was nearly solved, and the final solution was in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well, then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like the clanging of an alarm bell. What worried her most was not so much putting the powder into Dragon's bowl, but the fear that at the last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle it up somehow. That could wreck the plan. She looked towards the Fitzgibbons' farmhouse, and there on the back porch, lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass halfway to the chicken yard. The tip of his tail barely twitched as he debated whether or not they were near enough to spring for. He looked very big and very dangerous. "At least he's not looking in her direction." Mrs. Frisby hurried on to the bush, directly to the hidden entrance, and slipped inside. When she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard as before, but this time he greeted her very politely. "I've been expecting you," he said. "May I go in?" "If you'll wait just a minute, I'll get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisby had not noticed it before. "A doorbell," she said. "It rings a buzzer down below. If I push it 3 times, you'd see some action." "Action?" "That's the alarm signal. A dozen rats would come out this door, ready to fight. All the rest, with the women and children, would be hurrying out the back door." "I didn't know there was a back door." "It comes out in the woods, in the blackberry bramble. It's got a longer tunnel than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the elevator and stairway led them down, Justin paused. "Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look. He said you asked about the plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisby, "but he didn't tell me about it. It's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what we're doing." So instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber, where, as Mrs. Frisby had noticed, the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed like several more minutes. "Somewhere right along here," Justin remarked. "We're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around taproots, some as thick as fence posts." They went on until they came to a fork in the tunnel. "Right fork leads out to the blackberry bramble," said Justin. "Left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for the surprise." From ahead came noises, the sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping and of machinery running. They stepped into a room as full of activity as a factory. It was the biggest room Mrs. Frisby had ever seen, half the size of a house, with a ceiling and a floor of hard gray rock. It was lit brightly with electric bulbs, here the large-sized ones, strung unshaded, and beneath them were rats at work everywhere. Rats running electric motors that ran belts, that ran small circular saws, lathes, drills, grindstones, and other tools Mrs. Frisby could not name. Rats hammering, welding, cutting, but most of all, rats hauling. There was a steady procession to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large sturdy sacks, one on each side, like a miniature pack horse. As the rats trooped in, their sacks were empty. They disappeared into the part of the room that was hidden by the high wall of wood. When they came out, the sacks were full and heavy. As she watched, a troop of 10, their sacks bulging, went past her out the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded at her, but they did not pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance an electric fan whirred quietly, aiming inward, pulling fresh air into the room from somewhere out in the woods. Mrs. Frisby stood behind Justin and gaped. She felt dizzy at the sight, the motion, the noise, and the size of the room, which must have measured 20 feet long and almost as wide. "How could you ever dig out such a big room?" she asked. "We didn't," said Justin. "We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and floor are solid rock. That's the reason, or the main one, we chose this spot to live. Others had lived here before us, probably for centuries, before there was a farmhouse. Then, first bears, then wolves, then foxes, then groundhogs. We had quite a lot of cleaning to do, I can tell you. When we found it, there was a large hole only a few feet long, leading straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves that you could hardly see it. We closed that entrance entirely and dug out another longer, narrower one, our back door. Then we dug our living quarters under the rose bush and the entrance you came in. But the cave is still our chief workshop. Let's go in." As they entered, some of the rats looked up. Some waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work they had been doing, as if they were in a hurry. "They're all on schedule," Justin exclaimed, talking close to Mrs. Frisby's ear to be heard over the noise, "so they can't stop working." One group, especially busy, was gathered around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at the end. It looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, rather like the side of a small boat. Could the rats be making a boat? Then she saw that they were fastening a strong metal ring to the top of it. Justin led her to it. "That," he said, "is our most important invention, the key to the whole plan. We made a pilot model last fall. We tried it out and it worked, so now we're making 3 more. "But what is it?" "It's a plow. Nicodemus designed it himself after reading every book he could find about farm tools. It's light and sharp, specially made to be pulled by rats. It takes 8 of us to pull it, more if the turf is tough. But with it we can turn over in a day of hard work a patch of earth about 15 by 10 feet. "But why? What do you need it for?" "Come over here and I'll show you." He led the way to the back of the cave where the high wood stood. He opened the door and beckoned her. She stood in a large wooden bin, staring at her feet and rising in a slope of the wall of the cave was a small mountain of grain. "Oats," he said. He led her on, opened another door and another mountain. "Wheat," he said, and others, barley, corn, soybeans. "We've been building these stockpiles for a long time," he said, "all from Mr. Fitzgibbon's barn. We now have a 2-year supply for 108 rats, plus enough to plant for 2 crops in case the first one fails. In there," he gestured toward the last bin in the row, "we have boxes full of seeds for tomatoes, beets, carrots, melons, and a lot more." All the time they stood there, the steady procession of rats continued. They entered the bins, took off their harness sacks, filled the sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel out the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, like very large ants endlessly toiling on an anthill. Justin must have got the same impression, for he said, "If the ants can do it," Nicodemus said, "if the bees can do it, so can we." Why live without stealing, of course. That's the whole idea. That's the plan. All right. The next chapter is called The Toy Tinker. "We left the Boniface estate on the 1st of May, said Nicodemus. "We knew a lot more than when we went in. We had been there about 8 months. "Then," said Justin, "we found a toy tinker." They were back in Nicodemus's office. Mr. Ages, having rested, sat with them. "Not quite yet," said Mr. Ages. "No," said Nicodemus. "That was in the late summer. When we first got out, we began searching for a place to live permanently, or at least a place where we could stay as long as we wanted. We had a pretty clear idea of what we were looking for. We had had plenty of time to talk about it on the long winter evenings in the library between reading books. And reading we did. We knew very little about the world, you see, and we were very curious. We learned about astronomy, about electricity, biology and mathematics, about music and art. I even read quite a few books of poetry and got to like it pretty well. But what I liked best was history. I read about the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, and the Dark Ages when the old civilizations fell apart, and the only people who could read and write were the monks. They lived apart in monasteries. They led the simplest kind of lives and studied and wrote. They grew their own food, built their own houses and furniture. They even made their own tools and their own paper. Reading about that, I began getting some ideas about how we might live. Most of the books were about people. We tried to find some about rats, but there wasn't much. We did find a few things. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias that had sections on rats. From them, we learned that we were about the most hated animals on earth, except for maybe snakes and germs. That seemed strange to us and unjust, especially when we learned that some of our close cousins, like squirrels, for instance, and rabbits, were well liked. But people think we spread diseases, and I suppose possibly we do, though never intentionally. And surely we never spread as many diseases as people themselves do. Still, it seemed to us that the main reason we were hated must be that we always lived by stealing. From the earliest times, rats lived around the edges of human cities and farms, stowed away on men's ships, gnawed holes in their floors, and stole their food. Sometimes we were accused of biting human children. I didn't believe that, nor did any of us, unless it was some kind of subnormal rat bred in the worst of city slums. And that, of course, can happen to people, too. Had we then no use at all in the world? One encyclopedia had a sentence of praise for us. The common rat is highly valued as an experimental animal in medical research due to his toughness, intelligence, versatility, and biological similarity to man. We knew quite a bit about that already. But there was one book written by a famous scientist that had a chapter about rats. Millions of years ago, he said, rats seemed to be ahead of all the other animals, seemed to be making a civilization of their own. They were well organized and built quite complicated villages in the fields. Their descendants today are the rats known as prairie dogs. But somehow it didn't work out. The scientists thought maybe it was because the rats' lives were too easy, while the other animals, especially the monkeys, were living in the woods and getting tougher and smarter. The prairie dogs grew soft and lazy and made no more progress. Eventually, the monkeys came out of the woods, walking on their hind legs, and took over the prairies and almost everything else. It was then that the rats were driven to become scavengers and thieves, living on the fringes of the world run by men. Still, it was interesting to us for a while, at least, that rats had been ahead. We wondered if they had stayed ahead, if they had gone on and developed a real civilization, what it would be like. Would rats, too, have shed their tails and learned to walk erect? Would they have made tools? Probably, though we thought not so soon and not so many. A rat has a natural set of tools that monkeys lack, sharp pointed teeth that can never stop growing. Consider what the beavers can build with no tools but their rodent teeth. Surely rats would have developed reading and writing, judging by the way we took to it. But what about machines? What about cars and airplanes? Maybe not airplanes. After all, monkeys living in trees must have felt a need to fly, must have envied the birds around them. Rats may not have that instinct. In the same way, a rat civilization would probably never have built skyscrapers, since rats prefer to live underground. But think of the endless subways below subways below subways they would have had. We thought and talked quite a bit about all this, and we realized that a rat civilization, if one ever did grow up, would not necessarily turn out to be anything at all like human civilization. The fact was, after 8 months on the Boniface estate, none of us was sorry to move out of it. It had given us shelter, free food, and an education, but we were never really comfortable there. Everything in it was designed for animals who looked, moved, and thought differently from the way we did. Also, it was above ground, and that never really felt natural to us. So we left and decided that our new home should be underground, preferably if we could find it in a cave. But where? We thought hard and studied maps and atlases. There were plenty of those in the study. Finally, we reached some conclusions. To find a cave, we would have to go where there were mountains. There aren't many caves in flatbeds. And for food, it would have to be near a town, or better, a farm. So we wanted to find a farm, preferably a big one, with a big barn and silos full of grain near the mountains. We studied the maps some more, and it was Jenner, I think, who spotted this area as a good place to look. On the map, a big part of it was covered with the contour lines that showed mountains, and across these were written the words Thorn Mountains National Forest. Beneath that, in smaller letters, it said Protected Wilderness Preserve. Bordering this, where the mountains turned to foothills, the map showed rolling country with quite a few roads but hardly any towns, which we thought ought to mean farmland. We were right, as of course you know now. It took us 2 months of steady traveling to get to the Thorn Mountains National Forest, but we found it. We're under the edge of it right now, and there are plenty of caves, most of them never visited by people because people aren't allowed to drive into the wilderness preserve. There aren't any roads in the forest, but only a few jeep trails used by rangers, and airplanes are not permitted to fly over it. We looked at a lot of caves, some big, some small, some dry, but mostly damp, before we chose this cave and this farm. However, we found the toy tinker. It began as a sad sort of thing. We found an old man lying in the woods one morning near one of the jeep trails, not so far from here. And he had died. We don't know what he had died of. We guessed it must have been a heart attack. He was dressed in a black suit, old-fashioned in style, but neat and not ragged. His hair was white and his face looked gentle. I wonder who he was, where he was going, Justin said. Whoever he was, Jenner said, he wasn't supposed to be in here at all. We ought to bury him, I said. So we did, not by digging a grave, but by covering him with a high mound of leaves and stones and twigs and earth. It was in gathering material for this mound that Justin made the second discovery. He was back in the bushes out of sight. Look here, he called. I found a truck. It was a very ancient truck with a small round hood, but it had been lovingly polished and was wonderfully shiny. The body, which was square and large, had been rebuilt and painted red and gold. It had little windows with white curtains, and between them, lettered in gold, were signs. The Toy Tinker. Toys, repairs, hobby kits, model sets, electric toys, all work guaranteed. Obviously, the truck had belonged to the old man. He was a peddler and mender of toys. The red and gold wagon was his shop and his home, and he had driven into the woods to camp for the night. It was against the law, of course, so he had concealed the truck behind some bushes, off the trail, under a big beech tree. We could see where he had made a campfire, carefully surrounding it with stones and clearing away the brush so he would not set the woods afire. Beyond the beech tree, a narrow brook flowed. It was a peaceful spot. We could see what had probably caused the old man's death. One wheel of the truck had sunk into the soft earth and was stuck. A shovel lay near it. He had been trying to dig it out. The work had been too hard for him, and he had started to go for help when he collapsed. This much we could figure out just by looking. Then somebody said, "Whose truck is it now?" "It belongs to his heirs," I said. "Whoever they are," said Jenner. "He may not even have any. He seems to have been alone." "Anyway," said someone else, "how would they ever find it?" "That's true," I said. "We don't know who he was, and if we did, we have no way of notifying anyone. So I suppose, if we want it, the truck is ours. Why don't we see what's in it?" All right, and we are going to stop there for today. If you have been participating in our summer reading program, you can go ahead and write down 25 minutes of reading time, and we will be back tomorrow with more of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim. Bye!